Hi and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. I recently had an idea to do a new series that is going to go through some common sword terminology and look at quite what those terms mean, maybe a bit about their etymology, mostly about the history of the terms and really what they actually mean, because some of the terms for swords are actually quite confusing. And the good news is they aren't just confusing today, they actually at times were confusing historically. So we're going to go through and look at what some of these common terms are and really how they relate to everything else in the grand scheme of things. And we're going to start off with the cutlass, because it's something that I don't talk about often enough, really, and it's a sword that needs a bit more talking about. So what is a cutlass? Well, in basically very brief basic terms, if you want a shorthand version, a cutlass is a short cut and thrust sword used at sea or by seamen. Now that's the basic description of what a cutlass is, but actually what it is can be far more complex to actually explain, and its use as a term expanded beyond just that as well. So actually let's go back and look at quite what it meant historically, when it came in and how. So the term cutlass derives from the French Cutlass. I'm not a French speaker, so I hope I got the pronunciation right there, but yeah, it's derived from the Latin and it means large knife. So anybody that follows German martial arts will be quite familiar with that actually, because they use the term in German langes Messer or Großmesser, which means long knife or big knife. And that is used for a small cut and thrust sword that is basically pinned together like a knife, but realistically is a short sword. And in English, we'd usually call that kind of sword a form of falchion, which also relates back to cutlass, and we're going to get onto that a little bit later. So you will also in the 18th century come across the term couteau, which is another variation of the French Cutlass or the English cutlass. So those terms can be used sort of interchangeably. But actually what a cutlass is a short cut and thrust sword used at sea or by seamen. And it came into use in English around about the 16th century. By the 17th it was fairly common, and by the 18th absolutely standard for use with swords at sea. Now, in terms of what a description of a cutlass is, so I've got one example here. This is one of the most famous examples, which is curious because it doesn't really match what most people think of as a cutlass. When you say cutlass to people, they usually think pirate sword. So short, broad, and curved. Well, this is short-ish, and it's not that broad, and it's not curved at all. It's completely dead straight. So that's already a little different to what most people expect of a cutlass. And this is the Regulation 1804 British Navy Cutlass. So one of the most iconic cutlasses ever made, and it's straight. So actually the cutlass is just, short sword, cut and thrust, used at sea or by seamen. It can be straight and it can be curved. It can have various hand protection from little more than a traditional cruciform sword of the sort of, classic crusader sort of swords of the medieval period, all the way up to, this is called figure of eight guard, unsurprisingly, based on the shape of it. Bowl guards, technically speaking, you could have a basket hilt, although not exactly that common, but certainly bowl hilts became quite common. Various forms of cast brass hilts as well. This is iron, but yeah, you can have various materials, various levels of hand protection, but the key to the cutlass is that it can cut and thrust and that it's short. Now, what do we mean by short? The term short sword, there's another piece of terminology for you, is a little confusing. Now, the term short sword is really used to distinguish a sword from a normal-sized sword. So you have to decide what a normal-sized sword is, and then what's below that parameter is a short sword. And it's not an exact science, but I generally work to the rule of under about a 30-inch blade is a short sword. It's not, again, not exact. And this cutlass here, which is regulation, is 28.5 inch. They can vary between 27 and 29 inch in the blade, this particular 1804 example. So for a cutlass, they're actually quite long, but they're within that short sword category. They usually have only one edge. Most cutlasses ever made had just one edge. Some might have had a sharpened back edge in the last few inches, but not that commonly from what I've seen. They usually just have one sharp edge. Now, what are the swords are like that throughout history that have one sharp edge and are quite short, usually? Well, the Gross or langes Messer, also the Falchion, and other derivatives like in Italy you'll have the Storta, for example, which is an Italian falchion. And there's quite a curiosity because you've just been given the origin of the Cutlass kind of weapon. So the Falchion was a usually single-edged short sword, either straight or slightly curved, that was usually of munitions grade, a common soldier's weapon, could be a little higher class, but usually quite basic, a munitions grade. This is munitions grade, so it just means a simple, easily produced weapon for the common soldier. And basically, yeah, the Falchion is the origin of Cutlasses. And that's not quite so surprising when you look at it. It's okay, it's got a bit more hand protection than a Falchion would normally have, but otherwise it's much the same kind of thing. It's a simple single-edged sword, short, easy to carry, easy to wear, quite effective. So there you go. And in the 18th century, you'll see a lot of crossover with the term Falchion. So you will see short swords on land and sea, sometimes referred to as a Falchion. So the Falchion, the term was phasing out by the early 18th century, and terms like cutto, cutlass, hanger will really become in the parlance of our times for those particular swords. Now I've got 5 antique swords I'm going to be talking about here, because this is, you know, the famous Napoleonic era cutlass, and in fact this form of figure of 8 cutlass goes back to approximately 1730. It's hard to say exactly, but certainly by the mid 18th century this figure of 8 was in. It's just the grips were a little bit different. They weren't this is cast iron. They were just wood grips with a sheet of steel bent around them, which meant they were a little bit lighter in the grips, and the blades were also usually lighter as well. But this overall form of cutlass goes back to somewhere in the early to mid 18th century. Now, how does it differ to really other short swords? Well, that's where the term cutlass really deviates into something else, and that is the term used on land. So, as I said, cutlass is a term for the sea or for seamen, because of course sailors did fight on land plenty often enough as well, so it's not going to be just used at sea, but it is used by sailors and seamen and pirates and whatever else. But there is the term hanger. Now this is a hanger. This is a approximately 1760 to 1780 British infantry officer's sword. So this is, you know, American War of Independence era. And these kind of swords were also incidentally used by the Americans as well, because they mostly bought swords from Britain, France, Germany and elsewhere. Now, how different is this to a cutlass? Well, the answer is it isn't. Now, this particular example is a lot lighter. It's 2/3 the weight of this sword that I'm carrying. But that's just these particular examples compared to one another. I could show you hangers that are the same weight as this cutlass, and I could show you cutlasses that are the same weight as this hanger. So, and you notice that this one is also curved. So it's looking a little bit more like the cutlass that people might expect to see. And you might look at this and say pirate sword, and yet it's a British or English officer's sword. So yeah, you can have curved cutlasses, you can have straight cutlasses. You see the length is not too different on these two, but that is it. Cutlasses are roughly under 30-inch blades, usually single-edged, almost always actually. Double-edged cutlasses are very rare, and they are usually quite simple, but not always. Because this hanger could technically be used at sea, and then you might call it a cutlass, which is a little bit confusing. And therefore you can see the terms in the 18th century, that's the way they sort of evolved. Hanger is the term on land, cutlass is the term at sea, and the two swords could actually look absolutely identical, they just fulfill in different roles. And that's where it gets a little bit more confusing again. So as you get into the 19th century, the term cutlass takes on another usage, and that is with the emergence of the British police constabulary, the police force, and they had their own sword. So this is a regulation British policeman's cutlass, which really is not the term they should be using. It should be a hanger or a sword or short sword or something else. But they called it a cutlass, and well, we're stuck with it because that's what they used historically. And they very widely use the term cutlass for their little short sword like this. And at the same time, there were other examples of swords in a similar fashion being used, such as this, which is a Coast Guard and Customs sword, which also has a cast iron grip, just like this old 1804. But this sword is made by Enfield about 70 years later. Notice now, curved again, looks a bit more piratey, at least in the blade, but just has a simple stirrup guard, as you might expect of lots of Napoleonic army swords, troopers' swords, officers' swords, all sorts. So, and to give you one more example, this is a Napoleonic era British artillery, foot artillery hanger, so a common soldier's sword in the artillery. And again, it looks a lot like my Cutlass blade here. Actually, it's a bit shorter and it's a lot heavier, which is curious. Probably because this was intended more as a tool, but we'll go into this on another video. I'll make a video all about hangers as well, but you just had plenty in this video about the Cutlass. So those are the 5 swords that I wanted to show you. So ultimately it breaks down to the Cutlass is a term that came in the 16th century, really rose to fame in the 17th century. It's for short swords used at sea, usually by sailors and not so much by the officers, but sometimes. And it then evolved into being used for certain applications on the land where more commonly the term hanger was used. So there you have it. There is the Cutlass. And and this is the iconic Napoleonic era British Cutlass, which as you can see is straight, single-edged, figure of 8 guard. And what can I say about weights and balances and stuff like that? Well, the answer is it's not easy to say, because both hangers and cutlasses can be very light and they can be very heavy. So this is a real brute squad sword. So in this era, in the Napoleonic era, when British swords get to around 1 kilo, they are beastly. Now that depends on the era and the style of guard, the length of blade and stuff like that. So you can't always use that weight scale or yardsticks against all swords of all eras. But in the Napoleonic era, a 1 kilo British sword is heavy. So why is it so heavy? Well, partly because this blade doesn't have much profile taper. It's pretty much parallel. So it has a lot of mass, even though it has a lot of distal taper. So it's 9 millimeters thick at the shoulder down to pretty much 1 mil at the tip. So and very much complex distal taper here. So it distally tapers lovely. So actually it's not as heavy as it looks. And also then this cast iron grip adds a lot of total weight and brings the balance back. So this has an 11 centimeter balance, despite the fact that it weighs 1.04 kilos. And what does that mean this handles like? It handles like a downsized broadsword. So the Scottish or English broadswords, the basket-hilted swords, they usually handle something like this. They've got a fair bit of heft to them, but they balance fairly close to the hand because of the big basket hilt. In this case, the cast iron grip has done it, but it's much the same thing. So if you'll close your eyes and swing this around, it feels like a broadsword or a backsword. It doesn't feel massively heavy. It's got a fair bit of heft, but it's still quick to maneuver around. It's by far not a slow sword, and yet this hanger, for example, the artillery one, has a balance point of 20 centimeters and is an absolute beast. So you can't say a cutlass or a hanger is inherently lighter, faster, heavier, or whatever else than the other. There's massive variety. So you just got to look at the individual examples, how they're constructed, profile taper, distal taper, hilt weight, all these different factors. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope it's enlightened you a little bit and you now know a little bit more about the Cutlass. Thanks for watching and please do subscribe.